Hello, and welcome to the Talk Stew podcast. I am your host, Don Kloss. In this podcast series, I speak on topics that are an amalgam of science, philosophy, history, religion, sociology and society, business, language, literature and the arts, even politics and beyond. I am not supported by any company, organization, or other entity. This podcast is not a Patreon and is free, though you are encouraged to subscribe to this YouTube channel. The views expressed in the series are entirely my own and from my own experience and worldview. Talk Stew is a podcast originating from Columbus, Ohio. You can send your comments to me at my email address of 5254DKLOSS@gmail.com. In this edition, I take a look at the lobby and who's in it. Everyone knows what the lobbies are when it comes to our government, what goes on in Washington with our congressmen. But to start, what exactly are lobbyists and what do they do? Well, lobbyists are people who represent to our congressmen and women special interests or industries, corporations, large ones, and they try to influence these congressmen and women in what they vote on and what types of legislation they attempt to get passed. Now, you might think, well, there are good lobbyists and there are bad lobbyists. But that is subjective, based on each person's view. If, for example, you are for the use of coal for creating energy, you might think that the coal lobby is good. But if you are someone who happens to be an environmentalist, you naturally are going to think that someone who is a coal lobbyist is a bad lobbyist. Likewise, there are lobbyists that represent PETA, and if you are a staunch, very liberal animal rights activist or believe in that sort of thing, you will think that the PETA lobbyists are good lobbyists. On the other hand, if you are someone who feels that PETA's methods and messages and so on are too severe and incendiary, then you are going to think that they are bad lobbyists. So, where I head from this point is bringing up the fact and giving you some information regarding our Constitution and the amendments and Bill of Rights and what they have to say about lobbyists. And it's important and interesting because when our forefathers drew these documents up, there was no such thing as lobbyists. They pretty much didn't exist. There were certain industries or commercial ventures that tried to influence Congress in one way or another, but we didn't have lobbyists as we know them today. A lot of the lobbyists that we have today, and there are quite a few of them, are actually paid to do what they do. You have lobbyists from entities such as ExxonMobil and the NRA and large pharmaceutical, just to name three, who all have lobbyists, one or more, usually more, that are paid pretty well to do what they do, which is influencing Congress. You have a lot of other ones like lobbyists for and against certain societal causes, abortion rights, animal welfare, things of that nature, who are not paid what they do. It's done on a voluntary basis. But paid or not, when it comes right down to it, with these governmental documents that I spoke of, there is no provision for lobbyists within the Constitution and the amendments and the Bill of Rights. But at the same time, there is no provision, because of when these things were drawn up, to say that lobbying is not allowed, it's banned, or putting any restrictions on it. For example, saying you can lobby, but not if you are being paid professionally to do it. None of those things exists. And I am going to turn again to Corwin and Pellitzon's Understanding the Constitution, 9th edition, just to bring up a few points about this. So, first of all, in the Constitution itself, Section 8, it says that Congress is to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And Pelliton says this: Congress's power to regulate commerce with foreign nations is contained in the same clause as its power to regulate commerce among the states. In fact, Congress's power over foreign commerce is greater than its power over commerce among the states, although nowadays its power over commerce among the states is so expansive that this distinction between the two kinds of commerce is of no significance. More to the point, the clause places greater restraints on states' government's power than it does on the interstate clause. For example, a state can tax a domestic airline or railroad car if the airline or railroad car is in the state for a certain number of days, and the tax is proportioned to the time in the state. Does not discriminate against the interstate commerce, and if the tax is related in some way to services provided by the state. But such a test will not justify a state to tax on the ship of a foreign nation that may be docked in its ports. So here we see that commerce has the power to regulate both foreign and domestic commerce, but it doesn't say anywhere in here anything about them being influenced by third parties and their doing so, meaning lobbyists, or about creating bills or shooting down bills regarding commerce related to any influence by lobbyists. And Further in Section 8, regarding commerce among several states, it says, or Pelleton says, Congress is not obliged, when regulating commerce among the states, to consider the effect of its measures on matters that have been generally regulated by the states. Indeed, it may regulate intrastate activities, those within a state, when these substantially affect interstate or foreign commerce. And although Congress's measures are usually intended to benefit commerce, they are not required to do so. Congress may even prohibit or greatly restrict commerce in order to promote the national health, safety, and welfare, and for humanitarian purposes. So, when's the last time that you heard in the news about that happening? I don't think it happens very often, where Congress puts restrictions on intra or interstate commerce in order to promote national health, safety, and welfare and humanitarian purposes. They are usually going along with the influence of lobbyists in large part for what large industry wants. And to continue, it says, and again, this is still in Section 8, in reality, the Supreme Court has turned over to Congress the interpretation of the scope of its powers under the Commerce Clause. So the Supreme Court doesn't even want to be involved. Congressional regulations, when based on the Commerce Clause, are seldom challenged, and when challenged, the court, with cohesion that is rare, has no difficulty in concluding that Congress may regulate such purely local transactions as fees charged by real estate brokers and lawyers, or the mining of farmland, because these matters have no insubstantial effect on interstate commerce. To continue, he says, the Commerce Clause is important, moreover, not only as a grant of power to Congress, but also as a restriction on state power. In giving this power to the national government, the Constitution took it away from the states, at least in large part. Therefore, whenever a state, in professed exercise of taxing power or police power, passes a law that materially affects interstate or foreign commerce, the question necessarily arises whether this is not really an unconstitutional regulation of foreign or interstate commerce. Of course, if the state law conflicts with the federal regulation supersedes. Congress may allow states to regulate certain aspects of interstate or foreign commerce, including discriminating against commerce of other states. But, quote, if Congress ordains that the states may freely regulate an aspect of interstate commerce, end quote, as it had done with respect to insurance, quote, any action taken by a state within the scope of the congressional authorization is rendered invulnerable to Commerce Clause challenge, end quote. Although the state action may violate other provisions of the Constitution, for example, the Equal Protection Clause. When Congress is silent, the Supreme Court determines whether a state regulation that affects commerce is permissible, in the exercise of this power, the court has handed down hundreds of decisions, some of which involved vast commercial interests. It has laid down scores of rules about which volumes have been written. There is naturally so space for such matters in a book like this, but in essence what the court does is to weigh the local interest against the general commercial interest and then give the right of way to the interest that the court deems, all things considered, to be the more important one, which is usually the general commercial interest. So, again, here's a case of Supreme Court saying, I don't want to deal with all this stuff, you deal with it. And in dealing with it, Congress is going to be influenced by lobbyists, especially when you were talking about interstate commerce, when you are talking about major commercial enterprises and interests, the coal lobby, the oil lobby, and so on. And now here from Peltison's book are some examples of what happens when the Supreme Court gets involved. And I quote, "Out of the scores of hundreds of examples of how the Supreme Court, when Congress is silent, has performed this balancing role with respect to state police powers, those passed to promote the public health, welfare, and safety, here are a few. Florida could not ban out-of-state banks from engaging in investment advisory services. Arizona was not allowed to impose a 14-passenger or 70 freight car limit on interstate trains, nor could it require interstate trains to carry a full crew as defined by the state legislature. Minnesota could not ban the sale of milk in disposable plastic bottles. Illinois could not require interstate trucks to be equipped with specific kinds of contour mudguards. Wisconsin and Iowa could not ban trucks longer than 55 feet because such a ban placed a substantial burden on interstate commerce, and the evidence did not support the state's contentions that such regulations made the highways safer. Washington could not ban supertankers from Puget Sound, but it could require those without certain kinds of safety equipment to use tugboats. New Jersey could not prohibit the importation of solid or liquid waste which originated or was collected outside the state. Since this imposed on out-of-state commercial interests the full burden of conserving the state's remaining landfill space and was a freeze on the flow of the commerce for protectionist reasons. That's a whopper. Arizona could not require a California company to process cantaloupes in Arizona, for the burden imposed was excessive in relation to the state's minimal interest in regulating their packaging. North Carolina could not require Washington apple growers to use only USDA grades or no grades at all in the apples shipped into North Carolina, and thereby have to forego using the superior grade levels established by the state of Washington. And finally, Maryland could bar companies that produce and refine oil from operating retail service stations. So there you get a little taste. And here's something else that I find important from the book. At one time, states were allowed to prohibit the export of wildlife on the grounds that the birds and bees and animals belonged to the people of the state. But the Supreme Court has reversed this line of holdings. A state can no longer deny access to its local goods, be they animals, vegetables, or mineral. However, if a state itself manufactures products, it may, like a private business, decide to whom it is going to sell and restrict what it produces its own citizens. Thus, a bare majority of the court allowed South Dakota to confine the cement it manufactured to its own citizens. It could not restrict access to the limestone of the state from which the cement is manufactured, however, for that would fall under the line of precedence that applied to resources and wildlife. So, when the Supreme Court gets involved, as you can see, they are doing what Congress usually does, which is act on the side of commerce, and they kind of ignore the whole thing about safety and well-being and so on of the states. So Supreme Court involvement means that they will do what Congress would have done anyway, only without the involvement of the lobbyists. And we're going to jump ahead just a little bit here. In the what's called unwritten Constitution summary, because there is an unwritten Constitution within Article 5, it says this: continued and provided that no state, without its consent, shall be deprived of equal suffrage of the Senate. And the explanation here is, some consider this provision unamendable, and others contend that there are ways in which even it can be changed. It could be repealed, they say, by amendment, and then another amendment adopted by the regular procedure that would permit unequal representation in the Senate. And that one is a little scary, especially when certain lobbyists have the ears of certain senators. So now I am going to the amendments, and I am looking at the First Amendment, which, to remind you, is religion, speech, assembly, and petition, because this brings up a point. Under the section that says that Congress is not allowed to abridge the freedom of speech, the book says commercial speech is now entitled to constitutional protection, but there are common sense differences between it and other kinds of speech, so that it is subject to more regulation than are other varieties. Decisions of the Supreme Court dealing with more traditional First Amendment problems do not extend automatically to this as yet uncharted area. Overbreadth analysis is not applicable, perhaps not the prohibitions against prior restraint. Commercial speech is subject to a four-part analysis, and the book quotes, "At the outset, we must determine whether the expression is protected by the First Amendment. Number one, for commercial speech to come up with that provision, it at least must concern lawful activity and not be misleading. Two, next, we ask whether the asserted governmental interest is substantial. If both inquiries yield positive answers, then we must determine, three, whether the regulation directly advances the governmental interest asserted, and four, whether it is more extensive than necessary to serve that interest." Well, now the thing about this is, you've got, I don't know, probably hundreds, maybe more, lobbyists working in Washington, and they're far outnumbered by the 625 million or so voting age citizens of the United States. But those people, they're citizens. They are allowed to vote. I'm sure they're all registered voters. But they're trying to influence Congress when they are related to a large industry, for example. That's really considered commercial speech. And it's protected as long as they follow these four requirements. First of all, that it's lawful and not misleading. Next, that it asserts governmental interest that's substantial. And if both of those are true, then it has to be determined whether it advances government interest and whether it is more extensive than necessary to serve the interest. So that gives these people a lot of power with Congress, and the fact is that, relatively speaking, small group of people, because of where they are and what they do, their voice with Congress is much, much, much stronger than yours and mine as private citizens. Now, to continue, the book says, and I have a hard time with this one, the book says, a law forbidding false and misleading political speech would be clearly unconstitutional. Who is to say in the realm of political matters what is false and misleading? I would think it would be pretty clear myself. What is false and misleading advertising can be established. Moreover, advertiser access to the truth about their products and prices substantially eliminates any danger that governmental regulation of false or misleading advertising will chill accurate and non-deceptive commercial expression. Advertising via radio and television also merits special consideration and is subject to greater restraint than print media. But you know what? Here's why I have a hard time with this. How often have you heard on television or on the radio misleading advertising? You see a commercial on TV for a product, and then there is a large paragraph of fine print that is read at such a fast pace that you would never be able to understand it. That's misleading. It's misleading. And what about the large corporation that knows as far back as the early 1970s that its product is causing the users to develop a certain type of cancer, but they don't let anybody know, and they continue to manufacture, sell, and advertise that product on television and in print media and online as well for many years, until present day, when finally they have so many high dollar lawsuits against them that their sales are plummeting. That's most certainly misleading. But this says that a law forbidding false and misleading political speech is unconstitutional. But don't our politicians do this all the time? We have heard so much of it just in the last 6 years. We have just been bombarded with it. So to continue here, and I'm going to jump around a little bit here to this. Governments may not ban advertising of contraceptives, for example, a decision that caused Justice Rehnquist to protest bitterly that if those who vainly defend the heights of Bunker Hill so that men such as James Madison might later sit in the first Congress and draft the Bill of Rights, could have lived to know that their efforts had enshrined in the Constitution the right of commercial vendors of contraceptives to peddle them to unmarried minors through such means as window displays and vending machines located in men's rooms at truck stops. Notwithstanding the considered judgment of the New York legislature to the contrary, it is difficult to imagine their reaction. Well, Judge Rehnquist hit the nail right on the head. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. Now to continue here for a paragraph, this says, not only has commercial speech exception been withdrawn, but the court has specifically ruled that corporations, including utilities, are entitled to freedom of speech. A state may not prohibit corporations from spending money to influence votes off the referendum proposals, nor ban the promotional advertising by its bills. Justice Brennan and Marshall, two stalwart champions of freedom of expression, dissented from these decisions, contending that corporations as artificial persons spending stockholders' funds could be reasonably subject to limitations not permissible to natural persons. And I find that interesting as well. A state may not prohibit corporations from spending money to influence votes on referendum proposals. That is exactly what lobbyists do. And so that's considered freedom of speech for the lobbyists to talk to the Congress members in that way about those things. And I have even heard in some cases that there have been instances of lobbyists writing bills themselves and referendums and handing them to the congressperson that they're buddy with and say, hey, if you would, do me a favor, man, read through this and please try and get it pushed through Congress. It's just mind-boggling. And it's interesting that Brennan and Marshall dissented from that, saying that corporations are artificial persons because they're spending stockholder funds, which I'm sure that's probably how lobbyists are paid. And they could be reasonably subject to limitations not permissible to the average Joe. But obviously it continues. And a bit more about this, and I'm referring to the book again, to illustrate the application of generalizations, here are a few examples taken from a substantial number of Supreme Court decisions adverse to state action. Schaumburg, Illinois, was not allowed to forbid door-to-door or on-street solicitations of funds by organizations that did not use at least 75% of the money they collected for direct charitable purposes. Such an ordinance was unconstitutionally overbroad. It effectively prevented solicitation by advocacy organizations that use funds to advocate causes. Clean the air, ban the bomb, stop the production of nuclear energy, ban abortions, and so on. So that's kind of how it works, and in summary, the author says, the Supreme Court has come very close to the view that except for the narrowly defined categories of libel, obscenity, and seditious excitement to violence, pure speech, including that of corporations, unconnected with action, is constitutionally protected from any except reasonable time, place, and manner regulations. So that really opens the floodgates to allow lobbyists to do their thing in Congress, even though at the time that came about, there were no lobbyings. They didn't exist. And now, when we look at another little piece here, the section about, well, it says, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The thing I want to point out about this is what the author says here. What of public facilities such as libraries, courthouses, schools, or swimming pools that are designed to serve purposes other than public assembly? As long as persons use such facilities within the normal bounds of conduct, they may not be constitutionally restrained from doing so. And right there, if you think about that, Capitol Hill, that is a building that is designed to serve purposes other than public assembly. It's really not a public building. It's a government building. It's a closed building. But as long as these lobbyists go in there and they observe the normal bounds of conduct, as this says, they act appropriately, they can't be restrained from going in there. They can't be restrained from talking to congressmen because, again, they're citizens. They have the right to free speech. It just so happens that their free speech that they are using is to try and influence Congress in a certain way be it good or bad as we subjectively see it. So, just a couple of other things here on this tack. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but when we go all the way back to the Ninth Amendment, which is rights retained by the people, it states, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And, this says although the Supreme Court recognized that this amendment protects the right to engage in political activity against unreasonable national regulation until 1965, no law had been declared unconstitutional because of disparagement of any of these enumerable rights, nor had there been any suggestion that this amendment limited the powers of the states. So, this basically, again, you have to look at this from, I think, the point of view that a lobbyist is a citizen, and you can't take away any of their rights as a citizen, even though they are not acting as a citizen when they walk into the Capitol building. So that kind of holds the door open for them as well. And then the last thing having to do with this, in the appendix of the book, having to do with Article 1 of the Constitution, Section 7, and I quote, "All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. Every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it becomes a law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approve, he shall sign it, but if not, he shall return it with his objections to that House in which it shall have originated, who shall enter the objections at large on their journal and proceed to reconsider it. If, after such reconsideration, 2/3 of that House shall agree to pass the bill, it shall be sent, together with the objections, to the other House, by which it shall likewise be reconsidered. And if approved by 2/3 of that House, it shall become a law. But in all such cases, the voters of both houses shall be determined by yeas and nays, and the names of the persons voting for and against the bill shall be entered on the journal of each house respectively. If any bill shall be returned by the President within 10 days, Sundays excepted, after it shall have been presented to him, the same shall be a law in like manner as if he had signed it, unless the Congress by their adjournment prevent its return, in which case it shall not be a law. Every order, resolution, or vote to which the concurrence of the Senate and House of Representatives may be necessary, except on a question of adjournment, shall be presented to the President of the United States, and before the same shall take effect, shall be approved by him, and being disapproved by him, shall be repassed by 2/3 of the Senate and House of Representatives, according to the ruler's limitations prescribed in the case of a bill. So this is point and procedure of how a bill is passed. That's right out of the text of the Constitution. And to me, this begs a very large question. And that is, if a bill has come up that is, let's say, going to allow fracking by big oil or big gas in some of our western national parks, that's going to come before the president to sign. And when it does, is he just going to sign it willy-nilly? Is he going to ask, hey guys and girls, what kind of influence did we have in terms of the big gas lobby or the big oil lobby? How much did they influence you on this? I want to know before I sign this or don't sign it. Does he say that? He gets so many bills put before him, and I gotta believe probably not. It just doesn't seem like a real world thing that would happen. And as we've shown here so far, there's nothing in the Constitution or the amendments that say lobbying should not exist. And there's nothing saying that it should exist per se. There are, as I mentioned, things there that kind of open the door for that activity. But there is nothing that says, in this amendment we say it is okay for representatives of special interest groups and entities to try to influence Congress in whatever way that they do. So this is where I kind of probably get a little incendiary. I don't think this is the way our government should work. I don't think it's the way that our forefathers intended. Again, lobbying didn't exist then. They had no idea it would come to this, just like they had no idea that we would one day have Apache helicopters loaded with rockets, and that we would have automatic assault weapons and so on. They had no idea. They had no idea we'd have automobiles or cell phones or just so many other things. So, to be a purist, I don't think this is the way our government should work. My opinion is, number one, lobbying, whether it is subjectively good or subjectively bad, should be banned. I don't think this is the way that Congress should be influenced in what they do. I think across the board, at the federal level, at the state level, even at the local level, it should be banned. Period. Wholesale 100%. But now, I think that there is a much better way for government to take place regarding these bills, these referendums. And it's such a simple thought. More communication between voting citizens or voting age citizens and members of Congress and both the Senate and the House of Representatives. there should be regular open channels. And part of this, it's on us. There is just so much voter apathy and people not really being invested in our government and our due process. For example, the suburb of Columbus that I live in has a population of 37,120 people. And at our last primary election, just not more than a couple months ago, the voter turnout was 26%. Think about that for a minute. Out of 37,100 people, 9,600 voted. It's just incredible. And there are just so many people along with that who don't go to the polls, but when something happens in government that they don't like, they're the first ones to complain, and they complain loudly. And it just should not be that way. So I suggest two things. Number one, the government should set up a open line or a more easily open line of communication with the citizens. And this should perhaps be done through a website or through an email system where people can contact and air their views and opinions and concerns with their representatives and senators. Of course, this is going to require more government staff. Government's going to grow because of something like this, but I really think it's needed. And I really think it is something to be invested in. Because, if you got a corporation of, let's say, 50,000 people, and that corporation wants a bunch of senators to pass a bill having to do with, whatever. But what if instead of that there were, I don't know, 20 million people that email their senators and representatives, and then you got a certain percentage that want whatever that issue is and a certain percentage that don't. That should be what influences these people that supposedly work for us. Not lobbyists. Not people that take them out on golf outings and for expensive lunches and vacations and so on that they skirt under the law on. People should have to be engaged. That should be their option. And the other thing is, how often do we vote where there's issues on the ballot that are not local issues? Yeah, that often. I think we should be made to get off our butts, and we should be faced with, and hold on to your seats, I think we should be faced with monthly voting on issues. We citizens of voting age should have to go to the polls once a month to vote on these things that these congressmen and women are making decisions about without even listening to us. They should be voted on. Are we going to allow a new pipeline in Alaska in a wildlife area? It should be voted on. Are we going to allow fracking under New York City? It should be voted on. Are we going to spend $20 trillion or not on replacing falling infrastructure on our highways, our bridges? It should be voted on. All kinds of things like this that they make decisions on. A lot of them we don't even know a thing about it until after the smoke has cleared and we're yelling and screaming, well, we should have a chance to vote on them before Congress even is allowed to take votes on the referendum, as that amendment said, or that article said that I read. That's much closer to how government should work, with the congressmen and women having their ears bent by all of us, all 650 million of us, as opposed to a few thousand lobbyists that have special interests and they are representing entities that want certain legislation to go certain ways that benefit them, that benefits their shareholders, that benefits their bottom line, that benefits their industry, that secures the future of their industry hands down, period. I think it's a much better way to go. A lot of people will probably disagree with me on this, but it makes a lot more sense, at least to my mind, my subjective mind, than the way things happen now, where the lobbyists have a bigger voice than we do. We don't really vote very often on much of anything. A lot of times it's elections and not so much about legislation. I think that needs to change, and I think we would have a much better operating government if it changed in that way. So that's my slice. Stay tuned for Talk Stew number 4, where we are going to talk about Congress itself. Thank you for listening. Remember to subscribe to this YouTube channel, Talk Stew. And remember that you can send your comments to my email address at 5254DKLOSS@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.